I had seen 10,000 warriors kneel before my throne. Not one of them had ever made me feel anything except bored. Then the human walked in, and everything changed. My name is Empress Vaila of the Dravosi Dominion. I rule 17 star systems, for 100 billion subjects, and an empire so old that most civilizations in this galaxy had not yet learned to build fire when my ancestors were already mapping the stars. I have never knelt to anyone. I have never needed to. Every species in the known galaxy either fears us, serves us, or has learned very painfully why neither of those options is negotiable. I was not supposed to notice the human. He was not even supposed to be in the room. The selection of consort was the most sacred ceremony in Dravosi tradition. Once every generation, when the reigning empress reached the age of full sovereignty, she was presented with the finest warriors from every allied species in the Dominion. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were champions. Each one had been tested, evaluated, and certified by their home civilization as the peak of what their species could produce. The Korathi entry was 7 feet tall with 4 arms and skin like layered volcanic rock. He had won 14 consecutive championship bouts across 6 different combat disciplines. His people had sent him with a procession of 80 attendants and a ceremonial weapon that had allegedly been used to end a war. The Velnari representative had iridescent wings that spanned 12 feet and eyes that could track objects moving faster than most species could perceive. She had never lost a fight, not once in 23 years of competition. The Dravosi court had spent 6 months preparing the chamber for this event. The hall of selection was located at the highest point of the imperial spire, open on all sides of the sky, with the light of our home star falling directly through the center at the precise angle that occurred only 3 times per century. My advisors had calculated the date specifically. Everything was exact. Everything was as it had always been. And then, somewhere in the middle of the procession, between the Velnari representative and the Marathi delegation, there was a human. He was not tall by his own species standards, let alone by ours. He wore no ceremonial armor. His weapons, a standard-issue combat blade, and a sidearm of obviously practical rather than decorative origin, looked almost insulting next to the gleaming ceremonial equipment of the other candidates. He had a scar running from his left temple to the edge of his jaw that no one had bothered to conceal or treat cosmetically. He stood in line with the others and looked around the selection hall the way a person looks around a room. They are trying to understand rather than impress. I noticed him immediately. I was not supposed to. My chief advisor, High Council Marev, materialized at my shoulder the moment she saw where my gaze had gone. Marev had served my mother and my grandmother before me. She had been managing imperial ceremonies since before I was born, and she had an instinct for catastrophe that I had come to respect deeply. "The human should not be here," she said quietly, her voice carrying the specific tone she reserved for situations that required immediate correction. There was an administrative error in the invitation registry. His credentials were filed under a misclassified species designation. He was processed before the error was caught. I have already arranged for his quiet removal after the formal presentation. "What is his name?" I asked. A pause. "Commander Aaron Dast. Human military designation. Special Operations Division." He was stationed at the outer corridor outpost and apparently accepted the invitation without fully understanding what it was. I looked at her. He accepted an invitation to the Imperial Consort's election without understanding what he was accepting. Humans are, Marev searched for the appropriate word, occasionally imprecise about formalities. I looked back at Commander Aaron Dast. He had stopped examining the ceiling and was now looking directly at me, not with reverence, not with the carefully calibrated combination of admiration and submission that every other candidate was projecting with practiced precision. He was looking at me the way one looks at something genuinely interesting. I had not been looked at that way in a very long time. "Leave him in the line," I said. "Empress." He stays. Continue the ceremony. Morel was quiet for exactly 2 seconds, which was the longest I had ever seen her take to compose herself. Then she inclined her head and stepped back. The formal presentation proceeded. Each candidate approached the presentation point at the center of the hall, stated their name, their world of origin, and their primary achievement. The Karathi warrior's voice shook the windows when he spoke. The Velnari representative moved with a grace that made every other being in the room look slightly less refined. 17 candidates in total, each one extraordinary by any standard their civilization had ever applied. When the human reached the presentation point, he stated his name, his species, and then paused. Primary achievement, the ceremony moderator prompted. Commander Das thought about it for a moment. I kept my unit alive through the borderline campaign, he said. All 12 of them. 3 years in contested space. We came home. The hall was silent. Not the performative silence of an impressed audience. The actual silence of a room full of beings who had not expected that answer and were not entirely sure what to do with it. The Karathi warrior had cited his 14 championship victories. The Velnari representative had cited her combat record. Every other candidate had cited something measurable, something that could be compared and evaluated on a scale. Aaron Dast had cited 12 people who were still alive. I made my decision in that moment. I want to be clear about that. Not because he was the strongest, not because he was the most impressive, not because of anything that could be evaluated on the standard criteria. My advisors had spent 6 months preparing. I made it because in 17 years of ruling an empire, in 10,000 audiences and 100 ceremonies and an endless procession of beings presenting themselves as worthy of my attention, not one of them had ever answered a question about themselves by talking about someone else. I rose from the throne. The hall went silent in a different way. This was the silence of protocol, the recognition that when the Empress stands during the presentation, it means a selection has been made. It was supposed to happen at the end, after all candidates had been evaluated, after the advisory panel had submitted their recommendations, after 3 days of formal deliberation. I had been sitting in this throne for 17 years. I knew how the ceremony was supposed to go. I walked to the center of the hall. Marev made a sound behind me that she immediately suppressed. The advisory panel exchanged looks that communicated a great deal without words. The assembled candidates, all 17 of them, went absolutely still. I stopped in front of Commander Aaron Dast. He looked up at me. I am a full head taller than most humans. He did not step back. He did not adjust his posture to compensate for the height difference. He simply looked at me with that same quality of attention, interested, genuine, completely unperformed. Commander Dast, I said, you are not supposed to be here. I'm starting to understand that, he said. His voice was calm, not the forced calm of someone suppressing panic. Actually calm. I apologize for confusion with the paperwork. I can leave if... You kept 12 people alive for 3 years in the borderline campaign, I said. He stopped. Yes, he said. How? He blinked. It was clearly not a question he had expected. By paying attention, he said finally, by learning what each of them needed to stay functional, by making sure the mission never became more important than the people running it. I studied him for a long moment. Behind me, I could feel the weight of every gaze in the hall. The advisory panel, the foreign dignitaries, the representatives of 17 civilizations who had sent their finest candidates and were now watching the Empress of the Dravosi Dominion stand in front of a human who was there by administrative error and ask him questions. The selection ceremony traditionally concludes with the Empress indicating her choice. I said, this is that moment. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly. More like the look of someone rapidly reassessing a situation and finding that the reassessment leads somewhere unexpected. I should tell you, he said carefully, that I genuinely did not know what the ceremony was when I accepted the invitation. I know. And I should probably also tell you that I'm not. He paused, choosing words with obvious care. I am not what you would typically select for something like this. I know that too. So why? Because every other being in this room, I said, came here to impress me. You came here by accident, answer a question about yourself by talking about other people, and are currently trying to talk me out of choosing you. I held his gaze. In 17 years, no one has tried to talk me out of anything. He was quiet for a moment. That should probably concern you, he said. It does, I said. It also interests me considerably. The silence in the hall had reached a new quality entirely. I was aware of Morel behind me, standing very still in a way she stood when she was calculating whether an intervention was possible and concluding that it was not. I was aware of the Karathi warrior to my left, who was large enough to reshape geography and was currently doing nothing because there was nothing to do. I was aware of 16 other candidates who had prepared for months for this moment and were now watching it go in a direction none of their preparations had accounted for. I was not thinking about any of them. "The selection is made," I said, clearly enough for the hall to hear. "Commander Aaron Das of the human species is named Imperial Consort of the Dravosi Dominion." The silence broke into sound, not celebration. Something more complicated than celebration. The Velnari representative made a sound of pure disbelief. 3 members of the advisory panel began speaking simultaneously and stopped when they realized it. The 4 indignitaries communicated a great deal to each other in the specific language of carefully managed expressions. Marev's voice reached me from directly behind my left shoulder. "Empress, a word." "Later," I said, "the Karathi delegation will file a formal protest. They will file it with the Bureau of Ceremonial Affairs, who will review it according to standard protocol, which grants the Empress unconditional authority in all selection decisions. The protest will be dismissed." I turned slightly. "I know the rules, Marev. I wrote 3 of them." Marev closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Then she opened them and inclined her head. I turned back to Aaron Dast. He was looking at me with an expression that I would come to learn was a specific version of trying to process something that did not fit into any framework he had previously used. "I have some questions," he said. "I would be concerned if you didn't," I said. "This is going to be complicated. Most things worth doing are." He looked around the hall, at the 17 civilizations watching, at the ceremony that had just taken a turn no one had planned for, at the weight of an empire that had just landed on a decision made in 3 minutes by an empress who was supposed to deliberate for 3 days. Then he looked back at me. "Okay," he said. It was 1 word. Simple, direct, completely unornamented. The most honest response anyone had given me in recent memory. I realized, standing in that hall with the light of my home star falling through the open ceiling and 17 civilizations trying to recalculate everything they thought they knew about the Dravosi Dominion, that I had just made a decision that would change everything. Not because of what it said about him, because of what he had already started to make me think about myself. The protests came within the hour. I had expected them. Marev had prepared summaries before I had even left the selection hall, which told me she had been anticipating this outcome longer than she had admitted. The Karathi delegation filed 3 separate objections. The first argued procedural irregularity in the selection order. The second challenged the validity of a non-allied species candidate participating in the ceremony at all. The third was less formally worded but communicated with clarity that the Karathi champion felt personally insulted in a way that his civilization's honor code required to be addressed. I read all 3 in my private chambers that evening and set them aside. The Velnari representative sent a personal communication rather than a formal document. She was more direct than the Karathi. She wrote that she bore no personal animosity but wished to ensure I understood the diplomatic implications of my choice. Specifically that 7 allied civilizations had sent candidates with significant political investment in the outcome, and that choosing outside that group would require careful management of what she diplomatically described as strong feelings. I appreciated the honesty. I wrote back to tell her so. The advisory panel requested an emergency session. I scheduled it for 2 days later, which gave them time to organize their concerns into something coherent, and gave me time to have a conversation I needed to have first. I found Aaron Dast in the guest quarters that had been assigned to him pending the completion of the ceremony. He was sitting at the small desk near the window, looking out at the lights of the imperial city below. He had not changed out of his operational clothing. He had, however, removed the combat blade and sidearm and placed them on the desk in front of him in the careful way of someone who is trying to signal that they are not a threat without being obvious about signaling it. I found that detail unexpectedly thoughtful. "You should know what the next several days are going to look like," I said. He turned from the window. "I've been trying to imagine it," he said. "It's not going well. 7 civilizations are currently recalibrating their relationship with the Dominion based on today's decision. 3 of them have filed formal protests. My advisory panel is preparing arguments for why the selection should be reconsidered. The Karathi Champion's honor code technically requires him to challenge my choice formally, which means we will need to navigate that without it becoming an incident. He absorbed this. How do you normally handle situations like this? This situation has never occurred before, I said. So I am navigated the same way you apparently navigate things, by paying attention and making sure the mission does not become more important than the people running it. He was quiet for a moment. Then something that might have been the beginning of a smile crossed his face. You were listening carefully during the presentation. I listened carefully to everything, I said. It is the only real advantage that scales infinitely. He leaned back in his chair and looked at me with that quality of attention that I was already beginning to think of as specifically his. Can I ask you something? Yes. Why does it matter to you that no one has tried to talk you out of things? An empress with absolute authority over 17 star systems probably shouldn't expect pushback. It was a better question than most advisors had asked me in years. An empress who expects no pushback, I said, stops being able to tell the difference between good decisions and comfortable ones. I have been comfortable for a very long time. Comfort is how empires stop growing and start decaying without noticing. He thought about that. So you chose me because I argued with you. I chose you because when I asked about your greatest achievement, you talked about 12 other people. And then when I made a decision, you tried to protect me from it. I held his gaze. No one in my court protects me from anything. They protect themselves from me. There is a difference. The silence that followed was different from the silences in the selection hall. That had been the silence of ceremony and politics and 17 civilizations calculating their next move. This was quieter than that. This is still going to be very complicated, he said. Yes, I agreed. And the Karathi challenge situation will be handled to the formal diplomatic channel. His honor code allows for a resolution through official arbitration rather than direct challenge if the Empress invokes ceremonial authority. I will invoke it. You have an answer for everything. I have been running an empire since I was 22, I said. I have had a great deal of practice. I paused. What I do not have practice with is whatever this is. He understood what I meant. I could see it in the way his expression settled. Neither do I, he said. Then we will figure out the same way you kept 12 people alive for 3 years. I said, by paying attention. He looked at me for a long moment. Outside the window, the lights of the imperial city burned in the dark. Somewhere below, 7 civilizations were recalibrating and 3 delegations were drafting formal documents, and my advisory panel was preparing arguments. None of it felt as significant as it normally did. Okay, he said again. The same word, the same simplicity. I thought about 17 years of absolute authority and 10,000 warriors and 100 ceremonies and the specific weight an empire so old that most species had not yet learned to write when it was already ancient. I thought about a human soldier who had answered a question about himself by talking about other people. I thought about what it meant to choose something not because it was expected or strategic or safe, but because it was the only honest answer to a question you had been trying to ask yourself for a very long time. Then I thought about what came next. The protests would need managing. The Karathi situation required careful navigation. The advisory panel would need to be addressed with enough clarity that they understood the decision was made without enough force that they felt replaced rather than redirected. 7 civilizations needed to understand that the Dominion's relationships with them were unchanged even as its internal structure shifted. It was going to be a great deal of work. I had never looked forward to work more in my life. The formal audience with the advisory panel happened on the morning of the second day. They had prepared extensively. I could see it in the thickness of the document folders each of them carried, and in the specific quality of their collective posture. The posture of people who have rehearsed their arguments and believe their arguments are good. They were good arguments. Marev had clearly organized them. She had the sharpest strategic mind in the Dominion, and she had spent 2 days applying to this problem with characteristic thoroughness. The central argument was political. The Dravosi Dominion maintained its position through a network of alliances built over centuries. Those alliances were not simply strategic arrangements. They were cultural and symbolic as well. The consort selection was one of the primary mechanisms through which those alliances were reinforced. Choosing a candidate from an unallied species, particularly a species as new to the galactic community as humans, sent a signal that the Dominion's relationship with its established allies was less secure than it had been. That signal would require significant diplomatic effort to counteract. It was a sound argument. I acknowledged it as such. The analysis is correct, I said. The diplomatic effort required will be substantial. I am aware of this and have already begun planning for it. The senior panel member, Counselor Adrian, who had served 4 consecutive empresses, and whose career had survived more political crises than anyone else in the room, leaned forward slightly. Then you understand our concern, Empress. I understand it, I said. I do not share it. The stability of 17 star systems is not threatened by one selection decision, I said. What threatens the stability of 17 star systems is an empress who makes decisions based on what is easiest to defend rather than what is correct. I looked around the panel. None of you became advisors because you told my predecessors what was comfortable to hear. I need you to extend me the same quality of service. The room was quiet. The decision stands, I said. What I need from this panel is not further argument against it. What I need is your expertise applied to making it work. The Karathi situation, the Velnari communication, the 7 civilizations whose representatives need careful engagement over the next several weeks. That is the work. Are you able to do it? Adrian looked at Marev. Marev looked at me. Yes, Marev said. She said it in a tone that communicated several things simultaneously. That she disagreed, that she understood her disagreement had been heard and set aside, and that she would now do what she did better than anyone, which was solve the problem in front of her regardless of whether she would have created it herself. I had chosen my advisors well. That was worth acknowledging. Good, I said. We begin immediately. Aaron Das attended his first formal court function 3 days later. I had not required it. I had told him the timeline was flexible and that he should take whatever time he needed to adjust to the environment before participating in official proceedings. He had appeared at my office door the morning of the 3rd day and said he would rather be useful than comfortable. I had added that to the list of things I was learning about him. He was not what the court had expected. I could see that in the way they watched him move through the formal proceedings. He did not perform the elaborate status signals that most beings learn to navigate in formal settings. He was not rude. He was not dismissive. He simply behaved like a person who was paying attention to what was actually happening rather than to what was supposed to be happening. Several members of the court found this deeply unsettling. I found it clarifying in ways I had not anticipated. At the formal reception following the 3rd day's council session, the Karathi champion, who had remained at the station pending the resolution of his delegation's formal protest, crossed the reception hall and stopped in front of Aaron Dast. The room noticed. These things are always noticed. The Karathi warrior was more than a foot taller than Aaron and significantly broader. He had 4 arms, each one capable of independent combat function. His civilization's honor code required him to challenge my selection through official arbitration, which I had already invoked, but that was a formal process. This was a reception. The rules were different, and everyone in the room knew it. I was across the hall. I did not move toward them. I watched. The Karathi warrior looked down at Aaron Dast for a long moment without speaking. It was a specific kind of silence, the kind that is itself a statement. Aaron looked back at him without adjusting his posture or his expression. You are the human, the Karathi warrior said. His name was Champion Vreth, and his voice had a quality that I can only describe as architectural. The kind of voice that makes the space around it seem smaller. I am, Aaron said. I trained for 6 years for this election. Vreth said, I came here as the finest warrior my civilization has produced in 3 generations. I know, Aaron said. I saw the presentation. You were remarkable. The Karathi champion went still in the way large things go still when they have not received the response they were prepared for. You were not meant to be here, he said. I know that too, Aaron said. I apologize for confusion with the paperwork. I have the impression it caused problems for a number of people. Another silence. Vreth studied him. You do not carry yourself like someone who has won something, the Karathi warrior said. It was less an accusation than an observation. I haven't won anything, Aaron said. I've been assigned something. It's different. He paused. For what it's worth, I don't think you lost anything either. What you've achieved is real regardless of how this particular ceremony concluded. I watched Vreth process this response. The Karathi honor code is elaborate, and I had studied it extensively in the 2 days since the selection. It contains specific provisions for direct insult, for competition outcomes, for challenges and counter-challenges. It did not contain a clear provision for a situation in which the person who had apparently displaced you expressed genuine acknowledgement of your achievement and declined to claim victory. Vreth was quiet for a long moment. You are strange, he said finally. I've been told, Aaron said. Something shifted in the Karathi warrior's expression. Not warmth exactly. Something adjacent to it. The look of a person recalibrating in real time. The formal arbitration will proceed as protocol requires, Vreth said. That is not personal. It is procedural. I understand completely, Aaron said. I would expect nothing less. Vreth looked at him for another moment. Then he inclined his head, a small movement, not a formal bow, something less than that and more than nothing, and walked away. I had been watching from across the hall for the entirety of that exchange. When Aaron looked up and found me watching, I crossed the hall to where he was standing. How did you know to answer him that way? I asked. He considered the question seriously, which I had already come to understand was what he did with questions. I didn't know, he said. I just said what seemed true. He paused. Was that wrong? No, I said. It was exactly right. I have advisors who spend their careers studying Karathi diplomatic protocol, and none of them could have navigated that more effectively. He's not an enemy, Aaron said. He's someone who prepared harder than I did for something that didn't go the way either of us expected. That's not a reason to be adversarial. I looked at him. That approach, I said carefully, is either going to make the next several years significantly easier or it is going to confuse everyone around you so thoroughly that they won't know how to respond. Probably both, he said. Yes, I agreed. Probably both. The Karathi arbitration was resolved 12 days later in accordance with formal protocol. Vreth withdrew the honor challenge, citing a provision in his civilization's code that allowed for resolution when the competing party demonstrated good faith acknowledgement of the original candidate's standing. He communicated this to the formal arbitration panel and then, separately, sent Aaron a personal message that contained exactly 4 words. The message read, "You are worth watching." For the Karathi, that was high praise. Aaron showed me the message with an expression of genuine bewilderment. I explained the significance. He read it again with more care. That's, he started, a significant statement from a Karathi champion. I said, yes. He said. It was the smallest possible response to one of the largest possible recognitions from one of the most tradition-bound civilizations in the Dominion. I found it perfectly characteristic. The weeks that followed were the most unusual of my reign, not because they were difficult. I had managed difficult situations for 17 years, not because they were politically complex. Complexity was a normal condition of governing 17 star systems. They were unusual because for the first time in a very long time, I was learning something new every day, not about politics or diplomacy or the management of competing interests. I had deep knowledge of all of those. I was learning something harder to categorize. The way a person with no particular interest in performing importance carries themselves through a room full of people performing it. The way someone trained to keep 12 people alive in contested space evaluates a problem differently than someone trained to evaluate problems from the safety of an Imperial Advisory Panel. The way honesty lands differently when it comes from someone who has no reason to perform it. I had spent 17 years surrounded by the finest minds and most capable beings my empire could produce. I had learned from all of them, but I had always been, in some fundamental way, alone in a particular manner that comes with absolute authority, the specific isolation of being the person that everyone else is orienting around. For the first time, someone was not orienting around me. He was simply present, engaged, paying attention in the same direction, rather than paying attention to me. It was the most unfamiliar experience I could remember. I found myself making different decisions, not larger or smaller, or better exactly, but differently weighted. When the resource allocation debate for the outer systems came before the council, I approached it with questions I would not have thought to ask 6 months earlier, when the Velnari representative requested a private meeting to discuss the diplomatic recalibration Marev had been managing. I went into that meeting thinking about what the Velnari actually needed rather than what they were formally requesting. None of this was Aaron's instruction. He was not advising me on governance. He was, if anything, scrupulously careful to make clear that the Empire was mine and the decisions were mine, and his role was not to influence them. But he was there, present and honest and paying attention. And it turned out that being around someone who is genuinely paying attention changes how you pay attention yourself. At the formal ratification ceremony, which concluded the consort selection process and made everything official under Dravosi law, the chamber was full in a way it had not been full for a generation. Every allied civilization had sent their senior representatives. The foreign dignitaries filled the gallery. The advisory panel was arrayed in formal positions. The court was present in its entirety. I had stood in this chamber for 100 ceremonies. I knew every protocol, every phrase, every movement required. I went through all of them with the precision that 17 years of practice produced. At the conclusion of the formal proceedings, when the ceremony required the new consort to speak, Aaron looked out at the assembled hall, at 17 civilizations and 4 centuries of Alliance history, and the full weight of the most powerful empire in the known galaxy looking back at him, and said the following: I want to be honest with you all, because I think honesty is usually better than performance. I don't fully understand everything I've agreed to. I am going to spend a significant amount of time being confused and asking questions that probably seem obvious to everyone in this room. I am going to get things wrong. I am going to apologize and try to do better. And I am going to pay very close attention to the things that matter, because that is the only thing I know how to do that actually works. He paused. The Empress trusted me with something I did not expect and did not seek. I intend to be worth that trust, not by being what anyone expected, because I'm clearly not that, but by being present and honest and genuinely useful when it matters. He stopped. He had nothing more to add, so he added nothing. The hall was quiet in a way it had never been quiet in my memory. Then, from the gallery, the Karathi champion Vreth began a slow, rhythmic striking of his 4 hands together, the Karathi expression of genuine respect. It was not a common sound in diplomatic settings. It was real. One by one, other sounds joined it, different rhythms, different expressions from different species, but the same underlying current. I looked at Aaron standing in the formal chamber of the most powerful empire in the known galaxy, in clothes that were practical rather than ceremonial, having just given the most unpolished ratification address in 400 years of recorded Dravosi history. I thought about the selection hall, about the moment I had risen from the throne too early and changed everything with one decision, about whether I had understood at that moment exactly what I was choosing. I had not fully, not in all its dimensions. But I understood something then that I had been circling around for weeks. An empire this old accumulates its own gravity. It pulls everything toward the center and calls that pull stability. It grows comfortable in its own weight and calls that strength. It stops asking whether its way of doing things is the only way and starts calling its habits tradition. I had been born into that gravity. I had governed within it. I had done it well by the standards it provided. I had never once thought to question what it would look like from outside. A human soldier had walked into my selection hall by administrative error, talked about 12 people when asked about himself, and then tried to protect me from my own decision. He had introduced a variable my empire's gravity could not entirely account for. That was, I realized, exactly what I had chosen. Not a warrior, not a champion, not the strongest or the fastest or the most decorated. A person who paid attention, who kept people alive, who told the truth even when the truth was less impressive than alternatives, who looked at an alien empress in the selection hall and treated her like someone worth engaging honestly rather than someone worth impressing strategically. The sound in the hall continued. Aaron looked at me across the formal chamber with that expression I had come to think of as specifically his. Interested, genuine, present. I nodded once. He nodded back. Somewhere in the gallery, Marev was almost certainly revising her assessment of the situation in real time, which she would communicate to me later with characteristic precision, and a complete absence of any acknowledgement that she had been wrong. 7 civilizations were recalibrating. The Korathi champion was making a sound of respect. The advisory panel was doing what it did best, which was adapting to the reality in front of it regardless of whether they had planned for it. The Empire was, as it had always been, continuing, just slightly differently than before. I thought that was probably what empires needed most, and got least, something that refused to be entirely accounted for, something that paid attention, something that, when asked to describe its greatest achievement, talked about the people around it rather than itself. We were going to figure out the rest as we went. I was, for the first time in 17 years of absolute authority, genuinely looking forward to finding out what came next.